Okay guys, in this video I'm going to be talking about classical conditioning. The first video I made was on operant conditioning. Now this video is going to be on classical conditioning. Okay, so classical conditioning, because a lot of you guys were interested in that. Classical conditioning is not mathematical. So if you have not watched that video on operant conditioning, go to that video first and just at least listen to the first couple of minutes of that video. Okay, so what I talk about in that video is operant conditioning is very mathematical. It's very technical. It's very mechanical. It has nothing to do with feelings whatsoever. In operant conditioning, the subject is performing behaviors, and the person, right, the person that is the trainer or the researchers, whatever, right? You're the one that is arranging the mathematics to make behaviors happen more often or to make behaviors not happen as often. But it's purely mathematical. It's not emotional whatsoever. It has nothing to do with the subject's feeling about the behavior. It just has to do with the behavior, period. Classical conditioning is quite the opposite of that. It has not much to do with the behavior, but rather it has more to do with the feeling of the subject and how the subject feels about the situation, how the subject feels about the behavior. Okay, now we're talking about not so much of the technical, mechanical aspect of the animal or the subject, but now we're talking more about the emotional, so to speak, aspect of the subject. So in classical conditioning, this is also called Pavlovian conditioning, respondent conditioning. This is the type of conditioning, this is the type of approach that deals with associative learning, right? The associations that the subject makes to its environment or to certain factors in the environment. So I'll give you a quick example. Let's say, for instance, I don't like cats. Just an example. Let's say I don't like cats, and you could tell me, well, if I give you $100, will you pet this cat? And I'll go, yes, for $100, I'll definitely pet the cat, right? I will pet the cat, but that doesn't change my feeling about the cat. I just performed a mechanical behavior in exchange for a a consequence to that behavior that benefits me. So if I don't like cats, you can tell me, Will, every time you pet a cat, I'll give you $100. I will pet that cat all day long, but that doesn't necessarily change the way I feel about the cat. I'm just doing this from a purely mechanical and mathematical perspective. Whereas classical conditioning would be like, hey, Will, how about we work on you liking cats? Now it's different. Now we can work on something that has to do with me changing the way I feel about the cat. Okay. Now there are many instances in which classical and operant conditioning go together harmoniously and very, very nicely. But in this video, I just want to isolate classical conditioning because it's something that some of you guys wanted to learn more about. So with classical conditioning, we're talking about how do I feel about that cat in this hypothetical example. I actually like cats, but in this hypothetical example, I don't like them. And let's say I go, okay, well, how do I like them? Well, now there is an association that could take place, right? For instance, I could go, well, maybe one way to do it is every time you see a cat, good things happen. Good things happen to me. And maybe, I see a cat and without even having to pet him, maybe I actually get good things. Maybe, you start paying me $5-10 at a time every time I look at a cat. Well, if I look at the cat and just by being in the presence of the cat, I go, hey, I don't really like cats, but good things are happening when the cat is in my presence, when the cat is in the same room. I'm going to start making some different associations. I'm going to start looking forward to seeing the cat, right? This is a form of classical conditioning. This is a form of changing the way the subject, in this case me, feels about the environment or a factor in the environment, in this case the cat. So with dogs, it's the same way. Sometimes the behavior is not quite the issue, but sometimes the issue is this dog feels a certain way about that subject, about that environment, about the person, about the animal that it lives with. It feels a certain way. As a result of feeling that way, it's prompted to perform certain behaviors that are not desirable. So I can approach that from an operant conditioning standpoint by going, we're going to stop those behaviors, or we could approach it from a classical conditioning standpoint, which would be more like, we're going to change the way you feel about that, which will hopefully reduce you, or change the way you behave around that subject, around that environment, that animal, that person, etc. So that would be classical conditioning. Now, there are different ways to approach this, but classical conditioning is just associative, okay? Like the animal makes associations. The associations could be to the environments. They could also be to certain cues. So for instance, like the bell, right? This is a very, very common example that a lot of people are familiar with. Pavlov was a Russian biologist that was working on, or he was researching the digestion of animals, and he was using dogs as a subject. So when he was doing this, just to study the digestion process in dogs, he was feeding them, right? Obviously, that was part of the research. He was feeding them. When he started to notice this, salivation would start to happen. The salivation was just the body preparing itself for digestion. The salivation has to happen so that the animal can process the food in its mouth, and the salivation aids in the digestion. So that's part of the digestion process. What you start to notice is the salivation would happen before the food reached their mouth. And not only that, but it started to happen before even the presence of the food. Okay, so the dog would start to salivate, and so to isolate that, what Pavlov did is he started to ring the bell just before they would get fed. Ring the bell, they would get fed. Ring the bell, they would get fed. So what happened was these animals made an association to the bell. Okay, the bell became a cue to that would bring the food. So bell, and that would automatically prompt the salivation of the dogs. So what these animals did is they associated that cue. Now in classical conditioning, there could be many associations. Yes, they could be to an animal, to a dog, but they could also be to certain cues. Like for instance, they could be to verbal cues, right? Where the verbal cue doesn't just mean do this, but the verbal cue instantly could give a biological response. Just to give you a quick example without diving too deep into it, if, for instance, there is a dog that is walking around, and let's say he's walking around a part of the yard that I don't want him to, maybe let's say he's getting close to something that possibly looks like a snake, right? And as the dog is walking around, and I think, oh crap, I think there's a snake there, right? I might be right, I might not be right. And I freak out, so I scream a very loud no, and I rush. I say no, and as I say no, I run at the dog, freaking out, panicking, because I'm thinking, wow, he's getting close to a snake, or he's getting close to an area that I don't want him to get close to. I say no, I scream, I run at the dog because I'm freaking out. So here's what could happen. As a result of that, in that example, in that hypothetical example, what could happen is now the word no could instantly become a biological trigger to the dog, right? So, and this does happen, by the way. This is a way to do some forms of training for certain specific situations. But in this example, what I did in this example is I said no, and I accidentally gave a tremendous experience that was memorable to that dog. The dog heard me say no, and the next thing that happened is I ran at it. And I probably grabbed it and pushed it out of the way because I was freaking out. So now what could happen is, in this dog's mind, the no got paired up with a very, very strong picture in the environment. And now the next time this dog hears no from me, this dog might instantly go into that little bit of that, maybe not quite panic, but into a little bit of that biological response that tells them something bad is about to happen. Okay, so that is a form of associative learning. That is a form of classical conditioning. So that's one way in which this could happen. It's not just, you know, things. It's not just people, dogs. It could be something like that. So these are things that surround classical conditioning. Now, there are ways, techniques to address this. The techniques that are typically used in dog training and have been sort of researched in some depth are counter conditioning, systematic desensitization, which systematic desensitization and counter conditioning pretty much go hand in hand. There is flooding. There is habituation. There is sensory adaptation as well. And those are pretty much the primary ways to change the way a subject feels about its environment. So again, this is a little bit more complex because now we're talking about the associative nature of, you know, how this animal pairs things up. So flooding, I would have to make an entire video on that just because there's so much detail that goes into it. Systematic desensitization and counter conditioning, right? There's an entire video that could be made on that. And what counter conditioning and systematic desensitization deal with, they deal with the slow progression of changing, completely reverse, and that's what counter conditioning means. Counter means opposite. Making the animal go from I really don't like that to I really like that, right? Counter conditioning. So there are just different ways to address this, but those are the primary ways to kind of change the way the subject, the animal, feels about about its environment. Counter conditioning, systematic desensitization, flooding. There is habituation, sensory adaptation. That's pretty much how we could have an animal feel different about its environment or about different factors of the environment. All right, guys, if you guys have any more questions, if there is any more information that you want to learn about this, if you want to learn more about these types of these types of approaches, let me know in the comments. Let me know what you want to learn more about, and I'll see you guys in the next video.